philosophy, his little job as a sort of local guru, all of that was not only to do with my own personal stuff, but it was also to do with what was happening in Britain. And it's really that link that you look for. There's no point writing about your mum just for the sake of it. What you've got to do is somehow link the life of your mum somehow to the lives of other people's mums and what other people are thinking about and how they're living. Most of the writers that I'd grown up reading, like Forster and Orwell and Green particularly, who I worship, had written about colonialism. I couldn't write about colonialism, but I could write about reverse colonialism, which was us coming to Britain. And this huge rise in the amount of immigration in the 50s through the 60s and 70s and so on, and the way Britain had changed, and racism, skinheads, the extreme right and so on. So I found that some of the material from my own experience I could then turn into stories about what was happening in the country. And that was the link, I think, between me and the reader, not necessarily the relationship between me and my material, but the relationship between the reader and the material, which is the key thing.
When I was reading Buddha, I came across a dialogue which is one of the fundamental sort of issues that keep coming up with Pakistani English literature, and that is, there's a black writer, and she says to Karim, because he's looking for material, and I think she says to him, well, you shouldn't write this because it'll give a bad impression of your community, and of course he thinks that's censorship. Have you ever felt the burden of representation?
There was some of this stuff, particularly in the 80s. I remember being in New York with My Beautiful Laundrette, which was a big hit in New York in about 1986, 1987. And every Sunday there used to be a demonstration against My Beautiful Laundrette by something called, this was long obviously before the fatwa, by something called the Pakistan Action Committee. And they used to march up and down outside the cinema with their banners saying, "Down with Hanif Kureishi, ban this film." And occasionally they'd ring up the owner of the cinema and threaten to bomb him and blow him up as well. A pattern that, as we know, soon became established. And they used to, and I used to say to them, I used to turn up and talk to them. And I used to say to these guys, what's going on? And they'd say, well, you've written about homosexuals, haven't you? And I said, yes, I have. And they said, well, you don't seem to realize that there are no homosexuals in Pakistan at all. I said, what, not one at all? They said, no, not a single one. So you're showing us as being homosexuals, and you've got a completely the wrong picture. Having been fondled all over Southeast Asia, I had to say that this was not necessarily correct. And I understood the arguments about representation, because I thought, well, if there are not many films and stories and plays and so on about Pakistanis, and you're doing the only one, and they're homosexuals, I do understand their point of view. But on the other hand, you're a writer. I'm not doing PR. I just have to write the stories I like to write, and the stories that amuse me, and that's all I can do, and that's all that all of us as writers can do. You can't write pleasant or nice characters. There's none of that in Dickens or Shakespeare. It's just not interesting. It's the monstrous characters that are fun. It's the transgressive characters that are fun.
A lot of your work, including the Buddha, Suburbia, and Black Album, and lots of it, is permeated with references to pop music and pop culture, but also to literature, to Chekhov and a host of writers. How did literature and pop music speak to you while you were growing up, and how has it changed in contemporary British culture?
Well, I grew up in the 60s. So I had Indian stroke Pakistani father, and many of my friends were in bands. There was a group of us in the suburbs called the Bromley Contingent, who later formed bands like Susie and the Banshees and so on, Billy Idol, who was a mate of mine. So I was an Indian boy living in a suburban house, surrounded by these fascinating kids who later became photographers, who got involved in punk, and so on. I think what you have to try and do is write a book that contains all the stuff in it that's in your life, in your head. And in order to do that, you have to invent a new book. You know, I had to invent a book that I hadn't written before, a book, you know, in which an Indian boy is wearing velvet trousers and is wearing earrings and, you know, takes LSD, but also, you know, who has a father who's an Indian from an Indian family who now live in Pakistan. You have to find a way of putting all this stuff together. And that's the challenge and the difficulty of writing a book, that you have to, as it were, invent a book, write a book that hasn't been written before. And you have to find characters who speak to you, through you, and speak for you. It's a nightmare to do. It's very, very difficult, but I guess that's why people write books.
Okay. Then you came to Pakistan when you were about 30, I think, and you went to Pune and to Madras later on. How did that first trip and all these other trips influence your writing and your perception of yourself?
I remember coming to Kureishi, and I remember my dear Uncle Satu. So he said this wonderful thing to me. He said, "We're Pakistanis, of course." He said, "But you'll only ever be a Paki, won't you?" And I remember thinking, that's right. And that rather offhand remark had a big influence on me. I thought, when I went back to London, I thought, I've got to write about London, and I've got to write about England. And I thought England's got to change to suit me. I can't change, I've got to be who I am, but England's got to change. And really, through the 70s and 80s, and particularly in the 90s, Britain began to change, to become a multicultural society, so that people like me could say, you know, we're British, you know. We're not half English, we're not mongrel. It's not a question of us fitting in or not fitting in. The whole country had to change to make a place for us. So coming here for the first time and then going to India and so on made me think about how you make a society, how to make a society out of, you know, all these bits and pieces. And I have to say, it's really interesting in Britain. There's been British people who work really hard in terms of race. Recently there have been a number of cases, particularly with regard to football, about racism. And the authorities in Britain are really coming down hard on racism and refusing racist language, because they can see, they seem to have understood at last, that it's a terrible contamination and a real corruption of people's relationships, racism. And you just have to stamp it out in public life. So the country really has changed, and it's been a revolution. And if you go to France, and certainly if you go to Italy, you'll see that they're not half as advanced as Britain is in terms of its writing about race and thinking and speaking about race every day.
Now, I know you've only been here 24 hours, but what strikes you about Karachi after all these years?
Karachi looks much more run down now than it did last time. It looks really rough compared to the, it seemed more charming, I remember, in recollection. Now, when you walk around it now, it looks like a city that's sort of in decay, I'm afraid to say. I'm sure you're aware of that. Someone said to me, I think one of my cousins said to me, it's like a war zone here now. I said, I can see that. So, bad luck.
One of the questions I get, because you're in both my anthologies of Pakistani English literature, and I'm often asked, did Hanif Kureishi give you permission to include his work in this Pakistani book? And I say, well, yes. And then they want to know why I wanted to include him in the first place. I mean, I have my answer. Do you have an answer to that? Not for me, but from your point of view, what is identity?
I'm very happy to be included in your book. I'm very lucky to be in there at all. So I'm grateful. Thank you. If anybody reads anything I write, I'm still extremely grateful. And if you're a writer, what you want is to be read by people. I don't know what identity is. Identity really doesn't bother me anymore. I don't really think about it. I don't think about who I am in that sense anymore. Really, an identity is a relation between you and yourself, and then between you and your family and your place. And when I decided that I wanted to be a writer, and when later on I became a writer, it sort of, I felt sort of all right after that. I thought, that's what I am, I'm a writer. When I grew up in the suburbs, people used to say to me, "Who are you? Where are you from? Are you a Pakistani? Are you British? Where do you belong?" And I used to say, "I live in that house down there." And they'd say, "Where do you really belong?" And it gave me a sort of crisis. But later on, when I figured out I was a writer, it sort of saved me somehow. And it's who I like to be.
You turned your attention to the radicalization of young British Muslims long before anyone else. What made you explore this? How has the perceptions of Muslims and how has it been changed over the years?
Well, I noticed I was really interested in, influenced by my thinking, the fatwa against Rushdie in '89. It was a really big deal for all of us who are writers and also friends of Rushdie, that this man had written this book, and then there were lots of people who wanted to kill him for doing it. And it made me think very, very hard about writing, the importance of writing, what it means. We'd taken, as it were, free speech and writing for granted. You could just do and say anything by the end of the 70s, through the 80s, that you wanted. By '89, after the fatwa, it was really shocking, and it made me think not only about the place of writing, the meaning of writing, and what writers could do here in Pakistan and England and around the world, but it made me think a lot about fundamentalism. And I went to various colleges near my house, and I went to some of the mosques, and I made friends with kids that I would not, I guess, normally speak to, who were so-called fundamentalists, who wanted a revolution, who were extreme Muslims. And of course, in the 70s, I've been involved in the anti-racist movement in Britain, but that was allied to socialism, to the left. But suddenly these kids who were originally anti-racist had become what we call fundamentalists, or they were extreme Muslims. And I found this really shocking, because it occurred to me that people had come to Britain in order, as it were, to have more freedom, to reinvent themselves, to live new lives in the new country, and to find them, as it were, allying themselves to something, I don't know, some sort of a mixture of contemporary radicalism and a medieval philosophy. It was very shocking to me. So I spent a lot of time talking to them, and I wrote the Black Album out of that, about a kid who's drawn towards radicalism, and later on a very good film made by Udin Prasad, called My Son the Fanatic, which is partly about a kid who becomes a radical. And this was, as you know, then it seemed very new. But I remember my uncles in Karachi in the 80s talking about the terror of radicalism, and the horror of extreme Islam and so on, which I didn't at that time take that seriously. But of course now we all take it very, very seriously. And seeing its origins in Britain was very interesting for me. And I guess it was something that was happening in something I considered to be my own community.
Thank you. I think there are a lot of people who want to ask you questions as well. I have a whole lot more, but I'll keep them. And we open now to the floor. Any questions, please?
Is the lady over there? Okay, you go.
Hanif, when you first came here, I met you at your uncle Abu Kureishi's house. We were there, my husband and I. We were good friends of Abu. And we had a chat with you, and you said, nice country, pleasant people. You were complimentary, we were thrilled. Then you went back and you said the harshest things about Pakistan. I have never got over that. I said, what happened to him? He was a different person here. When he went back, he said something exactly the opposite. People said, you said, horrible country, don't want to go there again, things like that. How do you explain that?
Well, if you're a writer, you write as you see, and it's your job to speak the truth as you see it. And it would be absurd for me to write a piece saying that the Pakistanis or my family or whatever they're really nice people, that will be absurd. It's not the point. The point is to have a point of view about a place and to try and say interesting things. I would certainly not want to say anything that was unpleasant about anybody. That would not be interesting either. The point is to see the world as it is and to speak as you see it. And that's what you pay us writers to do. You know, when you read a book, you want to you want to know that the writer has seen cleanly and has something to say about his experience. Nobody else?
Just one more question. This is from your books. I get the impression that you have a very low opinion of women. Why is that?
I think that's just a sort of stupid thing to say, actually.
Well, I don't say that authors always come like messiahs. I mean, for the communities they might be connecting to. But I think communities do rely a lot on authors' writings. How do you connect yourself to the communities who might be connecting to you and your work?
Which community do you mean?
Like hush-hush themes that you pick on.
Like what?
The hush-hush themes that you pick on. I mean,
What do you
mostly
mean?
taboos, I mean, being talked about from a certain perspective in Pakistan. But people do connect to your writing on that.
I can't say that there is a community of people who read my books, because there will be people, I don't know, in Australia who would read them, or people who read them here, people who are 15 years old, people who are 60 years old. And what you call hush-hush themes, I guess, which is to do with sexuality,